The night the Duke collapsed had begun like many others in his country estate in the south of England. The manor rose over the landscape, with its grey stone walls, tall chimneys, and a garden carefully trimmed but rarely usado para algo, além de impressionar visitantes ocasionais. Inside, staff moved in a quiet, practiced rhythm, making sure every detail of the dining room met his standards. Candles aligned, cutlery gleaming, portraits of ancestors watching from the walls, with cold, painted eyes. At the head of the almost empty table, the Duke sat stiffly in his dark suit, a glass of water untouched by his right hand. Near his feet, his old Labrador lay curled on the polished floor, eyes half closed, but always aware of his owner's smallest movement. The dinner was not a celebration, more a habit maintained out of pride than pleasure. His children were absent again, each with a different excuse, and only 2 distant cousins had accepted the invitation. Small talk drifted over the table about markets, politics, and the fading influence of titles in modern England. The Duke listened more than he spoke, answering in short, precise sentences. Every now and then, his hand went to his chest in a discreet gesture, as if adjusting his tie, and the dog lifted its head, nose twitching in concern. No one at the table seemed to notice the change in his breathing or the slight tremor in his fingers as he reached for the glass. It happened suddenly. In the middle of a sentence, the Duke stopped, his expression frozen for a heartbeat. The glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor, water spreading under his chair. His face lost color, and his body leaned to the side before anyone could react. The Labrador jumped to his feet, barking once, a sharp, frightened sound that broke the polished calm of the room. One of the cousins shouted for help as the Duke collapsed onto the carpet, his eyes open but unfocused. Footsteps echoed in the corridor, and the butler rushed in, already pulling his phone from his pocket to call emergency services. While they waited for the ambulance, the staff tried to follow the instructions given over the phone. They laid the Duke on his back, loosened his tie, and checked his breathing, which came shallow and irregular. The dog paced around him in tight circles, then tried to lie down against his side, whining in distress, until someone gently pushed him away. Blue and red lights finally cut through the darkness outside the manor as the ambulance arrived, followed by paramedics carrying equipment that seemed both precise and impersonal. They worked quickly, checking vital signs, inserting lines, asking questions that nobody in the room could fully answer. The ride to London felt like a blur for the few family members who decided to follow. The Duke was transported to a private hospital, a modern building of glass and steel that contrasted with the old manor. In the emergency department, teams moved with practiced efficiency, attaching monitors, ordering scans and blood tests, and transferring him to the intensive care unit. Initial impressions suggested a serious, complex condition, but no obvious cause. By the time the first long night turned into a grey morning over the city, the Duke was sedated, connected to machines, his future uncertain. Back at the estate, the Labrador refused to stay behind. One of the staff members, aware of how inseparable man and dog had been for years, arranged to take the animal to a small flat owned by the family near the hospital. The dog spent the journey with his head on the seat, confused by the absence of the man who usually commanded his world. When they reached the city, the sounds and smells were different from everything he knew, but he remained close to the door, waiting for something familiar. As the flat door closed behind them, he walked straight to the coat laid over a chair, the one the Duke had worn at dinner. He pressed his nose into the fabric and stayed there, as if the fading scent could explain what had gone wrong and how to bring his owner back. By the second day in the hospital, the Duke's name had become a case file, a set of images and numbers discussed in hushed but intense voices behind closed doors. His reputation and title ensured access to the best specialists, and soon 5 senior doctors were involved: a cardiologist, a neurologist, an infectious disease expert, a toxicologist, and an experienced internal medicine consultant. Each had a desk full of notes and a mind trained to see patterns where others saw chaos. Yet, as they reviewed the tests together, what emerged was not clarity, but contradiction. The heart showed signs of strain, but not enough to justify such a dramatic collapse. Neurological scans revealed subtle abnormalities, nothing definitive. Lab results hinted at inflammation, then backed away from that conclusion a few hours later. In the conference room adjacent to the intensive care unit, the atmosphere grew heavier with each meeting. The cardiologist pointed to the irregular rhythm episodes on the monitor, arguing for a primary heart problem. The neurologist countered with subtle signs of possible central nervous system involvement. The infectious disease specialist suggested rare pathogens and demanded more cultures. The toxicologist listed potential environmental or chemical exposures that would fit some of the symptoms, but not all. The internal medicine consultant tried to hold the threads together, only to see them unravel again when a new test result arrived. They adjusted medications, tried different approaches, and watched as the Duke's condition fluctuated without fully improving. In the waiting room, his children arrived in waves. The eldest son, always polished and composed, spent most of his time on the phone, talking to lawyers and advisors about the title and the estate. The middle child, responsible for the family's business interests, asked more about financial implications than about his father's latest blood gas results. The youngest, a daughter who had moved away years before, stood by the window, arms crossed, her face torn between guilt and anger. None of them knew how to be in that sterile environment, surrounded by machines and terms they did not understand. They visited the room in short, awkward intervals, speaking to the unconscious figure in the bed more out of obligation than spontaneous affection. The Labrador, temporarily housed in the family flat, became a problem to be managed. The staff took turns walking him near the river and bringing him food, but he reacted with restlessness every time they returned without the Duke. On the third day, after much insistence from one of the nurses, the hospital agreed to let the dog come to a service entrance and wait in a restricted outdoor area. It was a compromise. The animal would not enter the ward, but could at least be closer. When the car carrying him stopped at the back of the hospital, he scrambled out and immediately pulled toward the building, sniffing the air as if trying to locate a single familiar scent among thousands. From one of the windows overlooking the service courtyard, a junior doctor watched the scene with curiosity. He had been assigned to the Duke's case as part of the internal medicine team, mostly to collect data and carry out orders issued by his seniors. The uncertainty surrounding the diagnosis fascinated and frustrated him, and he had spent hours reading through the file, trying to reconcile facts that refused to fit a single theory. Now, as he observed the Labrador pacing along the wall, occasionally stopping and staring at a certain point as if listening, he felt a strange pull of attention. It was nothing scientific, just a sense that the dog behaved as if something essential was missing from the human discussions upstairs. By the end of that day, after another meeting that led nowhere, the 5 senior doctors reached a reluctant conclusion. They had exhausted immediate possibilities. More tests could be done, but none promised clear answers. The phrase supportive care began to appear with greater frequency in their notes. They would keep the Duke stable, manage symptoms, and hope that time or a new sign would guide them toward a solution. In private, some admitted that they had little left to offer but watching and waiting. To the family, they spoke in careful professional language about a serious, uncertain condition and the need to prepare for all outcomes. The following morning, the junior doctor who had watched the Labrador from the window crossed paths with one of the nurses responsible for liaising with the family. She mentioned, almost in passing, that the dog seemed unusually unsettled whenever items from the Duke's house were brought into the flat or the hospital. Intrigued, he asked for details. She explained that when a staff member had picked up more clothes from the estate, the Labrador had reacted in a way she had not seen before, sniffing intensely, then backing away, whining, and scratching at the door as if trying to escape the smell. When the doctor asked which clothes, she replied that they were coats and jackets that the Duke often wore in his private study, and a particular pair of boots he used around the estate. That detail would not have mattered in most medical cases, but this one lacked logical connections. The doctor requested permission from the family to examine the clothes himself, under the pretext of checking for possible allergens or irritants. In a small consultation room, he opened the bag containing the garments and was immediately struck by a faint but distinct odor, something chemical layered under the usual traces of cologne and outdoor air. It was not strong enough to be obvious, but it persisted, especially in the lining of one heavy jacket and on the leather of the boots. He noted the observation without jumping to conclusions, aware that hospitals were filled with coincidences that meant nothing. Later that day, the Labrador was again brought to the courtyard. This time, the doctor went down during his break, carrying one of the Duke's coats in a sealed bag. He approached slowly, letting the dog see and smell him from a distance first. Then he opened the bag and held the coat out, watching carefully. The reaction was immediate. The dog moved toward the fabric, sniffed, and then stiffened, tail low. He backed away, eyes fixed on the coat, and let out a low, distressed sound. When the doctor set the coat aside and offered a different piece of clothing that had rarely left the hospital room, the animal sniffed it calmly and even pressed his head against it, seeking comfort. The pattern repeated when the doctor tested several items over the next days, with the family's reluctant consent. Clothes associated with specific areas of the estate triggered avoidance and discomfort, while others did not. The dog was particularly disturbed by objects that had spent long hours in the Duke's private study and a guest room that had recently undergone renovation. Each time the Labrador reacted, the doctor took notes, building a list of locations inside the manor that seemed to be linked, somehow, to the man's mysterious illness. Inside the hospital, the junior doctor tried to share his observations with the senior team. His proposals were met with polite skepticism. Environmental causes had been mentioned early on, then set aside when blood tests and imaging studies dominated the conversation. The idea of using a dog's behavior as a guide seemed to some like a distraction from serious medicine. Still, one of the consultants granted him a brief window. If he could gather more concrete data, they would consider expanding the investigation beyond the hospital walls. It was not approval, but it was not a refusal either. In his notes that night, the doctor summarized his growing suspicion. The Duke's symptoms, though complex, could fit a slow, progressive exposure to something in his home environment, a toxin, chronic mold, or a combination of poorly ventilated spaces and chemical products. The lack of a clear lab result did not eliminate that possibility. It only meant they had not looked in the right place or with the right method. The dog, who spent most of his time at the Duke's side in those very rooms, might be reacting to the same invisible threat, now tied only to the smell embedded in fabrics and leather. The decision formed quietly but firmly in the doctor's mind. If he wanted real answers, he would have to go to the source. The next step would not involve another machine or scan, but a visit to the manor itself, guided in part by the one creature that had been paying attention to the environment long before any of them, the Labrador, who refused to accept his owner's disappearance without protest. Arranging a visit to the estate required more negotiation than the medical part of the case. The family worried about privacy, reputation, and the possibility of any discovery leading to legal or financial complications. However, the combination of growing despair and the doctor's quiet determination eventually broke their resistance. One afternoon, under a grey sky heavy with clouds, the junior doctor, a member of the household staff and the Labrador, travelled back to the manor in a discreet car. The building appeared on the horizon like a memory of another era, its stone facade marked by time, yet still imposing over the surrounding fields. Inside, the air felt cooler and denser than the doctor expected. The entrance hall was immaculate, but the silence carried a stale quality, as if the house had been lived in by routines rather than by people. Dust did not dare settle on visible surfaces, but a faint mustiness lingered in the less frequented corners. The Labrador trotted ahead, nose low, tail slowly moving as he reacquainted himself with familiar territory. When they reached the main corridor, the staff member gestured toward several doors, explaining which rooms the Duke used most often. Before he could finish, the dog had already chosen a direction, padding firmly toward the private study. The study was a long, narrow room lined with shelves of books and old maps framed on the walls. A heavy desk dominated the space near a window that remained half-closed despite the daylight. As soon as the door opened, the dog hesitated, then entered with small, careful steps. He sniffed the carpet, the base of the desk, the armchair where the Duke had spent countless evenings, and the curtains that brushed the floor. The doctor followed, noticing that the air inside felt heavier, with a mild chemical echo, like the trace of cleaning products or paint that should have faded long ago. Near the desk, hidden behind a line of books, a patch of wall showed signs of a past leak, a faint, irregular stain under a newer layer of paint. The doctor asked about recent work done in the house. The staff member mentioned a renovation carried out months earlier in a guest room above the study and a small repair on a section of roof that had been letting in water. The building company had used strong products to treat mold and seal the walls. And for a few weeks the smell had been noticeable. The Duke, impatient and unwilling to leave his home, had insisted on staying in the manor during the work, spending most of his time in the study and the renovated rooms. The staff had complained quietly about the odor, but the situation had eventually become part of the background of daily life. They climbed the stairs to the guest room. Here, the air was worse. The windows were closed, the curtains drawn, and although the surfaces looked freshly painted, a sharp synthetic note floated just beneath the surface. The Labrador walked in, stopped near the bed, and almost immediately backed out into the corridor, nails clicking nervously on the wooden floor. The doctor opened the window and asked for the heating to be switched on briefly, wanting to see if the warmth would release more of the smell. It did. Within minutes, the chemical trace grew stronger, mixing with a damp undertone that suggested moisture still trapped behind the walls. Taking samples from the surfaces, the doctor carefully labeled every container, noting temperatures, positions, and the specific materials used in the renovation. He also examined a storage area where leftover products had been kept, discovering open containers of solvent and mold treatment stacked in a poorly ventilated corner. Their warning labels mentioned risks associated with prolonged inhalation, especially in enclosed spaces. The connection between these details and the Duke's symptoms was not absolute yet, but it offered a coherent path. Months of exposure to low-level toxins, combined with age and pre-existing health vulnerabilities, could easily create a confusing clinical picture. On the way back to London, the doctor reviewed his notes alongside the dog, who lay quietly on the car seat for the first time in days. The animal seemed calmer, as if having led a human into the heart of the problem had eased a tension he could not fully understand. The doctor knew that proving the link between the house and the illness would require more than impressions and smells. He would need specialized analyses, consultations with environmental health experts, and the courage to challenge colleagues who had already half given up on the case. Still, the evidence gathered in the shadows of the old manor felt more convincing than another inconclusive blood test. That night, in a meeting with the senior team, the junior doctor presented his findings with careful, measured language. He described the renovation, the products used, the layout of the rooms, and the dog's repeated reactions to certain clothes and spaces. He did not ask them to trust the animal. He asked them to consider the environment as part of the patient's body, one that had been left unexamined. Some of the older doctors remained skeptical, but others, including the toxicologist, leaned forward with new interest. The possibility of an environmental exposure began to shift from a dismissed idea to a working hypothesis. The Duke reached his most fragile point just as the first environmental test results returned. His blood showed traces consistent with chronic exposure to certain compounds used in industrial mold treatments and solvents. The levels were not dramatic enough to cause instant collapse, but they matched a slow decline resulting from months spent in inadequately ventilated rooms treated with those substances. Combined with his age, cardiovascular vulnerability, and the stress of his role, the exposure formed a pattern that finally made sense. What had looked like a fragmented puzzle now arranged itself into a picture no one had wanted to imagine. His own home had been quietly poisoning him. With a probable cause identified, the medical strategy changed. The team adjusted his medications to support detoxification and protect affected organs, stopped treatments that no longer fit the new hypothesis, and focused on careful, targeted, supportive care. They consulted environmental medicine specialists who confirmed that removing the patient from the source and giving his body time, along with specific supportive therapies, offered the best chance of recovery. The family, confronted with the idea that decisions about renovations and cost-cutting on proper ventilation had contributed to the crisis, struggled with a mix of defensiveness and remorse. Days passed in a fragile balance. Vital signs that had once swung wildly now began to stabilize. The Duke's breathing eased with each small improvement in lung function and overall condition. His level of consciousness fluctuated at first, drifting between sedation and brief moments of awareness, then slowly climbed toward more consistent wakefulness. The machines that had dominated the room remained present, but less menacing, as alarms grew less frequent. The junior doctor, now more involved than ever, visited often, updating the senior team and quietly acknowledging, in the privacy of his thoughts, the role the Labrador had played in opening a new line of investigation. Outside, in the courtyard, the dog maintained his routine. He arrived in the mornings, walked restless circles during the day, and left reluctantly in the evenings. On the morning when the Duke first opened his eyes fully and recognized the hospital room, the Labrador pressed himself against the wall below, as if sensing a shift in the air. Inside, the Duke's gaze moved from the ceiling to the monitors, then to the faces of the doctors and his children. There was confusion at first, and then fragments of memory returned. The dinner, the glass slipping from his hand, the feeling of exhaustion that had seemed normal until his body decided it could no longer carry the weight. Conversations that had been postponed for years began in that narrow space between bed rails and monitors. His eldest son spoke less about titles and more about the reality of managing an estate responsibly. The daughter, who had formed a life far from the rigid expectations of the family, sat longer at his side, asking questions instead of delivering accusations. The middle child, once focused almost exclusively on business, listened as the doctors explained how the renovations had been handled, realizing that lingering smells and complaints from staff should never have been treated as trivial. When the medical team finally declared that the Duke was out of immediate danger, a request that had been waiting for days resurfaced. Permission for the dog to briefly visit the room under strict control. Hospital rules were bent with caution. In a quiet afternoon, with staff prepared and the environment checked twice, the Labrador was brought through service corridors to a side entrance near the intensive care unit. His steps slowed as he approached the room, nose working, ears forward. When the door opened, he paused for a second, then walked straight to the bed, ignoring everyone else. The Duke turned his head and saw the familiar shape approaching. For a moment, all the tubes and machines faded from his awareness. The dog placed his front paws on the edge of the bed, careful and gentle, then lowered his head to rest it near the Duke's hand. The man lifted his fingers with effort and sank them into the soft fur. The gesture small but full of a gratitude he did not know how to put into words. The room, so often filled with technical terms and urgent orders, held a silence that felt less like fear and more like relief. In the months that followed, after discharge and a carefully monitored return to his estate, the Duke oversaw extensive changes to the manor. Rooms were aired, walls opened, damaged structures repaired with proper ventilation and safety standards. Experts were brought in not because of prestige, but because of competence. The old routines did not fully return, they evolved. He spent more time in the safer parts of the house, often with his Labrador at his feet, and maintained regular contact with the doctor who had insisted on looking beyond the hospital's walls. The story of his illness circulated quietly in certain circles, framed not as a scandal, but as a lesson about how easily danger can hide in familiar spaces. For the Duke, the greatest change was less visible. Surviving an illness that 5 doctors had almost given up on forced him to confront more than architectural negligence. It pushed him to reconsider the distance he had maintained from his own life, from his children, and from anything that demanded vulnerability. The dog, who had never left his side in spirit, became a constant reminder that loyalty sometimes sees what expertise overlooks. On quiet evenings, when the house breathed more freely and the garden lay in shadows, the Duke would rest a hand on the Labrador's head and accept, silently, that without this animal's restless protests and the courage of one young doctor, the manor might now be nothing more than a monument to a title with no living bearer.